Welcome, Steve McDonald. So I thought it would be cool since I don't think the model is super well known. If you could kind of just do a rough intro to both the process of change and then into the stages of development, and then maybe we could get into some stuff after that.
All right, shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Okay, so the researcher, Dr. Clare W Graves, lived in upstate New York, and he did most of his research work in the 1950s and 60s, and then continued to analyse and develop his model right through to the time that he died in 1986. And unfortunately, he died without publishing his work academically, so it hasn't been peer-reviewed in a journal, and consequently it's not very well known and not academically acknowledged. So despite that, it's a very, very interesting piece of work, and because it's about human nature, it makes sense, to anybody who's got the right kind of mind to understand what he's come up with. It just makes sense, if you look at your experience of life and human nature, everything that he says seems to fit. So I think it's a pretty good model. There are three important things that came out of his work. One of them was this relationship that he identified between the complexity of life conditions and the adaptive nature of human consciousness. So he used the term life conditions as an all-encompassing term, really, to describe not just physical life conditions, but also psychological life conditions. So what's going on inside your mind based on your history and your basic nature, your personality type, and those sorts of things. And what he found was that as life conditions become more complex, in other words, as there are more and more things for us to consider and more complex challenges for us to face, then human consciousness seems to naturally adapt, and it goes through a sequence of change, which I'll describe in a moment. And it ends up trying to match the complexity of the problems or challenges that we face in life. And so as our life becomes more complex, then under ideal conditions, our consciousness also operates in more complex ways, which gives us a greater coping capacity. And that's a really important issue to understand, because so many people in the world, particularly at this time, want to change the world, and they want to change people's minds, and they want to make life conditions better for people around the world. And the key to understanding how to do this is really not to try and force people to change, but to look at their life conditions and to change their life conditions for the better, so that their consciousness will then adapt and change their nature, change their behaviour and their values. So that's a really important thing. The actual change process that he identified that we go through isn't something new. It's been documented by many, many different researchers and philosophers, and it's basically what Joseph Campbell, the famous philosopher, called the hero's journey, where we encounter something new. And Graves described it in very, very simple terms, like an abbreviated version, where we go from a point of stability where life's fine and we're coping with everything, the challenges that are thrown at us. And then one day we wake up and we feel a little stressed. And usually when that happens, we don't know why we feel stressed. We just wake up and think, life isn't quite as good as it used to be. Something's not right. And the first human instinct in that situation is to think back to a time when life was feeling right, and to go on a regressive search for a way of living that's going to work better. And so we explore our old ways of living. We go back to the way we used to be. And we hear this language from politicians all the time, let's get back to the way things used to be, back to family values, make America great again, all that kind of stuff. So it's a natural human response to change. And it's usually playing out in a situation where we don't really understand what's changed or what we need to do in response to it. And then this regressive values search, it starts to increase the evolutionary tension. In other words, the potential for us to change increases. because by going back to older values, we're going back to simpler ways of living. And in the face of increasing complexity, and we live in a world, a reality that's always trending towards greater complexity, it seems, using an older and simpler value set actually doesn't work at all. In fact, it makes things worse. So it starts to take us on this descent into kind of chaotic kind of a situation. And what that does is it effectively breaks down our structures, our internal structures. So our way of living, our understanding of the world, our value set starts to come apart at the seams. And it has to do that in order to go through a transformational change. You can't make something change without loosening its structure. Otherwise, it just it won't come apart and transform. So by doing this regressive search, going back to an older value set, trying that out, we actually start to take ourselves in a sense further away from where we need to be in order to solve those problems, because we're getting simpler, not more complex. And I often talk about this rather as a slingshot effect, where it's like pulling the elastic band backwards on a slingshot. You're pulling it in the opposite direction, but you're actually increasing the tension on the band, which is giving it more potential for motion. And so it's exactly what's happening in our consciousness is we're moving further away from the complexity that we need, but in doing so, we're increasing the potential for us to change. And then once we get into this kind of, at the bottom of the cycle, a very chaotic place where usually we're quite uncomfortable and we don't want to be there, and we're desperately looking for a way out. And that's like being in the alchemist's furnace. It's where everything gets transformed, and it's in that place under that evolutionary tension and pressure that we start to rewire our neural networks, our body chemistry and brain chemistry changes, and eventually we will have some kind of an insight which comes from an altered perspective that will give us a clue as to what we need to do to get out of this situation. And often that will come through some kind of an altered state of consciousness. And we can get into altered states in all kind of ways. Dreaming, sleeping is an altered state. So it might come from an inspirational dream. It might come from an altered state practice if you have one, like meditation or sport or martial arts, those sorts of things. Or it might come from the use of plant medicines. Any kind of structured altered state activity can be really, really useful. And Clare Graves wrote in his notes that when people and societies are going through major change, there's always an increase in the use of drugs. And this is obviously why, because we need to find a different perspective, a different way of seeing things in order to make a new sense-making process for ourselves. So in that chaotic place at the bottom of the cycle, eventually we have that insight. There's an opening. We see things from a different perspective, and we'll break out. And so often this process is called revolutionary change, because it involves breaking out of a place of feeling trapped or blocked. And when that breakout happens, there's tremendous relief usually, because we feel like we've found an answer. And we can become quite evangelical too in this place. It's a classic born again kind of a situation where we see a new way of living life with new values. And we become energized and we want to just move as quickly as we can in that direction. And then we go through a process of renewal and integration where we're reorganizing our life, we're reorganizing our value set, our body, our biological systems. And with time and integration, then we find ourselves back in a place of stability again. Our consciousness has adapted in a way that allows us to cope with greater complexity. And when the complexity of our consciousness matches the complexity of the problems that we're facing, then everything's good again. We can solve the problems, and we go back to being comfortable and wanting to stay there. We love to stay in stability. Humans don't like to go through change. And so that cycle takes us from stability through turbulence and into chaos, through this breakthrough process, renewal, and then back to new stability again. But the new stability is higher up. So if the old stability is here, we go down this dip and then back up to this new stability, but it's in a more complex place. So this is less complex, that's more complex. And so there's been a process of growth that's occurred there. And really this was the second important piece of Graves' research, was just to map out this trajectory of change. Like I said, he's not the first guy to do it. There have been many, many other books written some thousands of years ago that really accurately mapped this process. It's just that he produced it in a very condensed way that's easily understandable, and also in a way that relates to human consciousness. But the famous Taoist book, the Tao Te Ching from China, which was written a couple of thousand years ago, that's a very detailed map of change, much more detailed than Clare Graves wrote about. So this knowledge has been around for a long time in different forms.
Do you see the Indian yugas and Plato's ages kind of fit into that as well? The kind of the golden age to the dark age cycle?
Yes, absolutely. It's all the same change process. It's the nature of change in this reality that we live in, and everything goes through that same process. I mean, simple things like this, the weather seasons do the same thing. Winter is that place where everything's fallen apart, the leaves are falling off the trees, and things appear stuck. And then come springtime, there's the breakthrough, and then summertime, you're back to the stability again. So you can map this process onto pretty much everything, and it's a lot of fun doing that. Years ago, one of the things I did was I mapped Clare Graves' change process onto the 5 elements diagram or process from Chinese medicine, and it fits exactly. Yeah,
very cool.
So 2 things so far: that relationship between the complexity of life conditions and the adaptive nature of human consciousness, the change trajectory or change process. And then the third thing was when he started to notice that people were moving from less complexity to greater complexity, and there were like milestones or particular stages that we would pass through, then he by looking at patterns that showed up in the people he was researching, like he started to notice that when they changed, they would either change from an individually focused way of living to a communal way of living, or back the other way from communal to individual, and this was consistent. But the places they ended up in after they changed weren't always the same, so we eventually figured out that there was this progressive, like a ladder, or eventually I'm now calling it layers of consciousness, because what happens is they're not discrete things that we move from to, they're actually like layers that get wrapped over the top of each other. So like the layers of skin, or layers of an onion rather, you'll have one value set, you'll go through this change process, and then that'll wrap another value set over the top of it. The old values don't go away, they're still accessible, but usually there'll be one particular value set which is dominating most of your life. And often that's the most recent one, because it's the most capable in terms of solving problems. And so I'll quickly run you through what Clare Graves called the stages of development, and what I'm now calling layers, because I'm just trying to get that message across that they're not discrete stages, but they're wrapped around each other. So the first one is a very, very basic automatic way of living. It's like a hunter-gatherer kind of existence. And you're basically just responding to urges and instincts and satisfying your needs as soon as you can. And we can equate that to the original hunter-gatherer kind of existence that we were in a couple of 100,000 years ago. And these stages apply not just to the history of our species, but also to our personal history as well. So we can look at our time as an infant when we're a newborn baby, and we're really just living automatically. So there's no expression of culture or art or anything like that. We're just basically breathing and living and eating and existing. And then the second layer is a community-oriented layer. So the first one was individually oriented. We swing to community. And as we go through these layers, you can imagine like a big pendulum that's swinging backwards and forwards between expressing yourself as an individual and then expressing yourself as part of a community. And so the second layer is a traditional tribal way of living. We think back to when we moved out of being hunter-gatherers and became villagers in tribal villages. And at a personal level, it's like when we were young kids in family life, and the family is kind of like a tribe. There's a everyone has a set position and role within the tribe. There are customs and taboos, things that you do, things you don't do, and that it was the first communal way of living that humanity expressed. And of course, it's a very effective way of living and very persistent. And there are many people still living that way on the planet now, which suggests that they're living in sets of life conditions which are simple enough that this is all they really need to solve their problems, is to have that tribal structure around them and access to the basic needs of life. I'm just flick something off my screen there. So from the traditional tribal, we swing back to the individual way of expressing ourselves again. And the third layer is what Clare Graves called egocentric. It's a power-oriented way of living. It gave rise to a kind of a martial society where power was the way that problems were solved. And this time, I've tried to sort of pin these transitions to times in history. The transition from hunter-gatherer to tribal pretty clearly happened roughly about 50,000 years ago, because one of the things that changed then was this massive explosion of culture, which Terence McKenna spoke a lot about, where all of a sudden there was all this art and stuff that arose that hadn't been there previously. And part of the reason that happened was that by living in community, we could share our tasks. We started to grow a bit of food locally instead of having to go out and gather it. And it gave us spare time to sit around and look at the stars and tell stories and make baskets and paint things and that kind of stuff. So back to the third layer, egocentric, power-oriented. It's a very raw way of living, and it's the last layer in what I call the pre-rational zone. So these first three layers are essentially about living according to our urges and instincts, and following our feelings, satisfying our needs, and the rational mind hasn't really kicked in to any significant extent yet. And this is why if you go into countries where people still live in these ways, like one of the places I visited is Papua New Guinea, which is an amazing island just north of Australia, and they're way up in the rainforests that are very, very remote. You know, there are no roads for miles in some places. People have very, very different ideas about time, as an example, and distance also. You know, you can ask them, how far is it to the next village? And they'll say, long way liklik, which means long way a little. And so whereas in the value set that we live in modern Western society, we have very specific and tight ideas about time and distance. Those things just don't exist because they're living completely in a different reality. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think about these different layers of consciousness as different worlds, different realities, and they really are. So from the third power-oriented layer, which may have emerged around about 10, 15,000 years ago, which was a time when the Earth was going through massive Earth changes. Graham Hancock's been digging up a lot of interesting history around this, talking about the Younger Dryas event, which is a big disintegrating meteor or comet that hit the Earth and caused enormous disruption, possibly was the source of the flood stories that are everywhere around the world, and maybe displaced a lot of people from their homes, which means that they had to leave their sacred land, go outside their tribal boundaries, find a new place to live, and in the process they were bumping into other people who were trying to defend their boundaries, and that may be why we saw this upsurge in power-oriented behaviour and large-scale violence around that time. And then the fourth layer takes us into what I call the rational zone. So at this time in history, the frontal lobes in our brains came into fuller development, which gave us the capacity to moderate our instincts and basic urges. We'd still have those instincts and urges arise, but then the rational mind could say, well, I know that if I follow those, it's going to cause problems for me, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something differently. And that gave us much greater coping capacity. And the fourth layer is another communal layer, and it gave rise to all of the large ancient societies that we've read about. And it also came most likely around the time or sometime after the agricultural revolution, where we discovered how to grow large-scale crops. And by doing that, it enabled us to live in larger towns and eventually cities and build very complex societies. And when you have a whole bunch of people living in close proximity, you've got to have a rule set for everybody to follow. And to follow a strict rule set, you need the rational mind to be at play. And so around this time in history, we saw the rise of strict rule sets for living. A lot of them were religious in form, so the Ten Commandments and their equivalent in the other major religions, where everybody knew about and acknowledged this set of rules that they should follow. And that allowed us to live together in larger groups without too much chaos. And the kind of thinking that arose at layer 4 was very linear, absolutistic thinking. And again, the older, like Old Testament kind of religions are a good example of this, where there are very strict rules and really severe consequences if you don't follow the rules. And the communal layers also have a longer understanding of, or a longer sort of perspective on time. In the individually oriented layers, we tend to think more in the present moment and in short spaces of time, so not too far into the future, because we're mostly focused on the material world. And in the communal layers, it's very much about long cycles of time, and we're more interested in changing ourselves to fit with what the community and the world needs of us. So the fourth then transformed into the fifth layer, which is the modern scientific industrial era, which we all know pretty well. If you look at the time scale of these different layers or eras as they played out throughout history, the time scales are getting shorter and shorter. So we spent maybe a couple of 100,000 years, or at least 150,000 years as hunter-gatherers, and then about 50,000 years ago we became tribal people, and then maybe 10 to 15,000 years ago the power-oriented, egocentric way of being human emerged, and then sometime after that, the history is a little bit sketchy, but we saw the rise of the major civilizations, probably at least 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, or longer than that. And I'm talking about the people like the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians, ancient Greeks, etc. And then it was only about 300 years ago that we saw the emergence of the modern scientific industrial layer. And I also like to talk about these layers as different ways of being human. They're like a tool set, or like colours on an artist's palette, that we can choose different ways of expressing human nature. And most people are familiar with the modern scientific industrial. It really, in a way, I think it's brought us peak rationalism. It's very materialistic. It was marked by particularly the scientific revolution and the industrial revolutions, but also the Enlightenments. There were a couple of different Enlightenments, including the European Enlightenment. And most of the people listening to this podcast have been born into an era where this fifth layer, the modern scientific industrial, has reached its peak and is starting now to fade. So these eras and layers within us as individuals, they emerge in like a wave form, where they'll slowly rise up, and then the wave will peak, and then it will slowly decline again once it's reached its peak. And as it's declining, then a new wave, which is the next layer, comes through and takes over as being the dominant paradigm, whether it be in our personal life or in global society. So just to bring us up to the fifth layer from an individual point of view, I spoke before about early family life as a child, then into the teen years, where we become conscious of our own power. We want to stop following the rules of mum and dad, and we want to make our own rules, and we become pretty wild. And that's the egocentric third layer, how it shows up at an individual level. The fourth, sooner or later, when we're living in a wild way, it takes its toll, and we start to think, well, actually, I can't keep living this way because it's not going to work. So I've got to knuckle down and, get a regular job and think about my future. And that's what normally happens when this fourth layer emerges at an individual level. And then given the necessary complexity of life conditions, people might develop beyond that into the fifth layer, which is, they in the fourth layer, they've been following a rule set, which is someone else's rules, always from some kind of higher authority. And then in the fifth layer, we start to think that we can make our own rules again, because it's another individually oriented way of living. And we become focused on personal success, and we look for different options that are going to bring us success, which is different from the fourth layer, which is very linear. There's only one way to do things there. So we find ourselves at this time on the verge of a global transformation from the modern scientific industrial into the sixth layer, or the postmodern era. And Clare Graves called this the relativistic way of being human, because it takes us from the individually oriented way of modern living, where we're looking for options to find the best way for personal success, into a communal way of living again that is very network-centric. It has the benefit of the wonderful technology that we have now, which connects us all remotely all around the world. And it's very humanistic. It's very much focused on the human experience and human values. And it's driven by a desire to connect deeply with other humans. And so what we're seeing now is the emerging turbulence in the early stages of this transition. As I said before, these changes come through in waves, and we saw an early wave of this postmodern way of being human emerge back in the 1960s and 70s with the social justice movements, anti-war movements, the New Age movement, flower power, and all that kind of stuff. And at that time, it didn't have the necessary scaffolding to support it. But now it's the way another wave has come through, and we've got the internet, which is like a scaffolding that can hold up this amazing, large-scale, community-oriented way of living. And so I'm pretty certain that this time it's going to stick and it's going to supersede the modern scientific industrial. And there are very clear signs that the modern scientific industrial way of living is declining, because we can see that our political systems don't work very well anymore. Our economic system is struggling. And at the same time, there are new technologies and new ways of doing things which are rising very, very rapidly, commonly termed disruptive technologies and exponential technologies. So it's a very exciting time. To quickly finish Graves's sequence of development, from the sixth relativistic or postmodern, he then found that there was an enormous leap in human capacity that occurred between 6 and 7, and this was like literally off the charts. It was far beyond any change that had occurred in the previous transformations between layers 1 and 6. And he found that in this seventh way of being human, there was more coping capacity than all of the previous 6 coping capacities added up. And that is mind-blowing. It's hard to get your head around. It's literally a quantum leap in human capacity. And it's another individually oriented way of living, but it's very integrated. So whereas in what became known as the first tier of consciousness, which is layers 1 through 6, there's a very strong swing between these individual and communal ways, and they represent the dominance of the left or right brain. So the individual ways are left brain dominated, the community ways of living are right brain dominated. Very, very distinctive difference. Changes occurred in this swing from one to the other. As we move into what's called the second tier of consciousness, which begins with layer 7, this integrative way of living or being human. It's called integrated because for the first time we get considerable interaction between left and right brain. So it's not such an extreme swing one way or the other. And whether we're looking at individual things or communal things, both hemispheres of the brain are intimately involved in that process. And that's part of the reason why we get this extra coping capacity. The other part of the reason is that we seem to become disentangled from all of the issues that arise through layers 1 to 6. So let me quickly go through them. Survival issues at layer 1, family issues at layer 2, power issues at layer 3, issues of righteousness and duty at layer 4, issues of personal success and competition in layer 5, issues of social acceptance and finding a balance in life in layer 6. And by the time we get to 6, all of those things are very active. And so we are living in a very complex situation where we've got to try and solve all of these issues, and they all impact each other, of course. Whereas when we make the leap to 7, it's like we become disentangled from those, and the importance of them just falls away. And what that does is it gives us all of this spare psychological capacity. So all of the attention and energy that we were putting into worrying about, family and duty and success becomes available again. It's kind of like you clean out your hard drive and you've got all this spare space and memory that you can allocate to problem solving. And that superior problem solving capacity that comes then makes it very easy to attend to all of those other issues anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a very interesting thing. And because the length of time that each of these different paradigms takes to play itself out historically, we've now got it to the point where we've got parallel value systems at play much more than have ever been before. Like, for example, when we were living as hunter-gatherers for like 150,000 years, there was just one value system. That was it. When tribal came, there were 2 value systems, but only for a short, period towards the end of the hunter-gatherer era. But now, because the paradigms themselves are very short, there's more impact from the overlap, and also because these higher or more complex ways of being human, like 7 and 8, which I'll describe in a second, are so they're so impactful in terms of empowering people to be able to do things and solve problems in the world that you don't need a big percentage of people to be at that place for them to have a big impact on the world. And so we're getting, I've never done a full analysis on Elon Musk, but he's certainly, if he's not at 7, he's certainly in transition from 6 to 7. And, you can look at the impact that he's had on the world already, just one guy, and we're going to see a lot more of that during this transition of the mainstream to 6. So it becomes very complex in the way that these different systems are interacting with each other. And quickly to talk about 8, Clare Graves only found 6 people out of his 1,065 that he studied who made the transition to layer 8. Didn't get a lot of data on it. He recognised it as a communally oriented system, extremely sophisticated, extremely complex in the way that it made sense of the world, and extremely capable. The degree of change between 7 and 8 had reduced again, so it was kind of back to the amount of change that you would get in the first tier between the layers there. It wasn't another quantum leap. Quantum leap was between 6 and 7, and then change settled down again, and we got a less substantial increase to 8. But he described it as being a really kind of spiritually oriented, almost mystical kind of way of living that was very much driven by a deep intuition, which I call like a quantum consciousness. If you think about quantum particles and the way that they can communicate with each other regardless of distance, it's kind of like that direct knowing, like we're tapping into that quantum field and we can just know things by direct knowledge. And it's likely, layer 8 is being a communal system. It's likely to be the first system that brings true global stability, whereas we haven't had that yet. I see layer 7 as being like a big problem-solving layer. You can look at the world now and see the tremendous complexity that's arisen from having these 6 different ways of being human coexisting on the planet, the impact that we've had, particularly from the scientific industrial era, on our natural world, and all of the overlapping issues that are arising, including natural issues like climate change. And the complexity of the problems is going to need layer 7 consciousness to really bring useful and practical solutions. And then 8 will be like the stabilizer that will bring some sort of global coherence. And it's also, these layers 7 and 8 are also opening us up to different dimensions of reality. So multidimensional awareness, what some people are calling in New Age circles this fifth dimension. Access to the fifth dimension is part of that transition process.
Awesome. So I often find it pretty fascinating to think about, just to look at where we're at right now and kind of play with putting certain things that are happening into this format. And one of the things that I've been noticing a lot is, I don't think I've heard you yet describe that in the way of how all of the stages are kind of like more relevant than ever, or they're kind of in this equal playing field. And that's really interesting, and it makes me think about how it seems like there's a lot of, like 5 and 6 are very much both having large amounts of power and influence, where like you see things like the trying to control like politically correct language through legislation, or Amazon pulling down documentaries about anti-vaccine documentaries, or what else? Just these things where some of it seems like it's layer 6 trying to be inclusive maybe and to protect people that are more vulnerable and sensitive. But then you see also the pushback of layer 5 kind of trying to hold on to their power and maybe their gains or whatever, and kind of, so there's this kind of war between the two, if you could put it in that way.
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. If we think back to previous paradigm shifts, we can get a sense of the kind of thing that is possible. I guess as an American, one of the more relevant ones, for you would be the American Civil War, which really was a war between layer 5 and layer 4. Okay, so you had the more rigid absolutistic thinking, which thought that societies ought to be class-based, and so it had full-on slavery and that kind of stuff. And then you had layer 5, which was a more progressive kind of a value system, which was about being the best, personal success, breaking down the rigid structures of the older layer 4 way of living. And that, that ended up in a civil war, of course. And layer 5 won because it had a higher coping capacity. So the interesting thing about layer 6 is that Clare Graves wrote that it's the most peaceful version of humanity that we've seen yet. So it's extremely unlikely to resort to physical violence, because its main driver is deep human connection, and it has an enhanced capacity for compassion and for interpersonal relationship. So most of the pushback that we're seeing from 6 against 5 is about communication. It's being communicated verbally on the internet, in writing and that kind of stuff. And so it's like an information war. Yeah. And it can still get pretty nasty, of course. But layer 6, one of the significant things that changes between 5 and 6 is that up to and including 5, we make sense of the world as if we're standing in one place and looking out at it, right? And in layer 4, we're standing in one place and we're looking at the right way to live, which is a single linear path from now into the future that we've got to follow. And that path is given to us by God or some higher authority. In layer 5, what happens is that single path splits into multiple paths, and Clare Graves actually called layer 5 multiplistic for this reason. And we start to see opportunities to take different paths, but we're still seeing those opportunities from our single position, right? We're looking out at the different pathways that we might take. What happens in layer 6 is that we obtain the capacity to shift our vantage point. So we're no longer standing in that same spot that we've been standing in layers 1 through 5 and looking out on the world from. We're actually able to move from here and go over there and look back at where we've been, and we're able to conceptually put ourselves in the position of other people, like putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And I think the North American Indians call this the wisdom of the moccasins, where you can act as if you're standing in someone else's shoes. You can see things from their perspective. You can quite literally feel what they're feeling from layer 6. We have this enhanced emotional capacity. And so that really complicates things, because if you think about quantum mechanics and what's known as the observer effect, different observers looking at the same thing from a quantum perspective can have very different outcomes and very different understandings. And we're starting to see that show up in the world. And what it's doing is it's collapsing our layer 5 understanding of science, because people are looking at scientific facts from very different angles, and they're looking at them with different priorities, like priorities on the human experience, human values, rather than materialistic facts. And so it's creating a lot of confusion in the world. And part of the role of 6 really is to lay the foundation for this massive leap to 7. And part of that change process is to loosen things up so that we have the capacity to make this radical change between 6 and 7. And so I often question whether we'll see any real global stability as layer 6 plays out as the dominant global paradigm, because of its nature, it's likely to uncover a whole lot of hidden things that layer 5 have constructed, because layer 5 is, its way of operating is very much like a poker player in a poker game. It has its own agenda, which it doesn't share. It keeps its cards to itself, because information is power, and if I give you my information, I'm giving away my power. And so all of the things that have been constructed in the world, in our social systems, are starting to be uncovered as 6 exercises this capacity to see things from very different perspectives. And we're getting people within governments and within other organisations who are transitioning from 5 to 6, and all of a sudden, all they want to do is show everybody else, what's on the cards, and that is undercutting the power of these layer 5 organisations. It's collapsing them in many cases.
So then it seems like layer 5's reaction to that is to kind of double down.
Absolutely.
And go even harder with trying to manipulate information and...
Absolutely. And, this is just human nature. Like, if you've been in charge of something and you think it's just fine, someone else comes along and wants to change it, the first thing you're going to do is push back. You don't want change. People don't want change. And so, yes, we're already seeing a lot of pushback from 5, and the doubling down is playing out in things like this crazy surveillance capitalism that we're seeing, where literally, here in Australia, there are scientists analysing our wastewater in the sewers, to try and see what different drugs people are taking. It's just insane, the lengths that it's going to. And, it's only going to get worse until the time that it collapses. So why one way of thinking about,
Sorry, I was just going to say, why won't that work? Like, you hear all this dystopian nightmare scenarios sometimes of complete state control and surveillance.
Yeah.
And in your opinion, why isn't that going to work?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the reason that change is happening in the first place is because the complexity of life has increased. And it doesn't matter what layer of consciousness or what era or paradigm you're talking about, the way that things progress is that the new way of thinking, the new paradigm, solves the problems that were created by the old paradigm. But over time, it creates new and more complex problems. And the only way to solve those more complex problems is to transition to a more complex way of thinking, a more complex layer of consciousness. And so it's inevitable. It's just a cyclic pattern that happens. It's inevitable that change will come. And you can look at past examples, as I said, and see how this process has played out throughout history. So, I guess one way of answering your question is it's just the way things are. It's the natural order of things. The second way is that if we look at the detail of what I just said, layer 5 has created information technology. That information technology has connected us together, which has increased the complexity of our society. Mm-hmm. It's also increased the visibility of things within our social institutions. And it's that visibility which is undercutting the power of layer 5's way of doing things. Because instead of holding its poker cards close to its chest and having an ace up its sleeve that you don't know about, all of a sudden somebody says, "Hey, I just found an ace right over here," and they put it on social media, right? It was up this guy's sleeve, and of course that guy's not going to win the game now, right? Because someone's uncovered the fact that he had an ace up his sleeve, and that's metaphorically how things are playing out, and it's all over the media, all these crazy stories coming out, things that were once considered conspiracy theories are being shown to be actually true. Yep. And there's going to be more of that. It's a great time of uncovering the shadow. And astrologically, there's a big Pluto influence during this time, which kind of represents that uncovering of the shadow aspect.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like that is happening more and more on an individual level too, where people are kind of working through past traumas and stuff. It seems like, at least it could be my lens that I'm looking through, but it sure seems like there's a lot more talk about people. And so is that something... Yes. Especially from first tier to second tier, do you have in Graves' research, or in your opinion, is there at all a thing where if you have a blockage at a certain layer or trauma from a certain layer, where you kind of have to go back through and revisit those areas? And
yes, yeah, exactly. So each time we go into a communally oriented layer, there's a tendency to turn our attention inwards. And when we go to an individually oriented layer of consciousness, it's the opposite. Our attention is turned outwards. And in the individual layers, we want to change the world to suit us. In the communal layers, our focus is on changing ourselves. And so 6 is a communal layer, so there's this inward attention. As people would notice, there's a big upsurge in different healing modalities. There's a great interest in fixing ourselves. And because 6 is the final layer before this big jump to 7, you can't jump off a wobbly platform. It has to be solid. And so part of the charter of layer 6 is to go inside, look at our history, look at all of these different layers of consciousness, which incidentally equate to the chakras, and to make solid anything that is still needing attention. And so we're looking at our past traumas, we're looking at anything inside us that we need to clear. In a practical sense, what this is doing is clearing dense energy pockets out of our body. And the transition from 6 to 7 is also about a transition into the activation of what has been called in New Age circles the light body. And the light body is a more sophisticated, subtle energy geometry that becomes active. It's laid over the top of what's already there. So we've got our energy meridians in the body, we've got our chakra systems, and then the light body geometries get laid over the top as an additional layer of complexity. And those light body geometries, they literally embody the consciousness, the higher consciousness for us. And so they are essentially geometries made of light. Light is essentially consciousness.
Something else you spoke on, is it in layer 7 that we move to the trans-rational?
Yeah. So 3 zones that I talk about are the pre-rational, which is layers 1, 2, and 3, where it's just basic urges and instincts that we live by. If we're hungry, we want food now, so we go looking for it. In the rational zone, which is 4, 5, and 6, where mainstream society is at the moment, everything's about rational processes, and the mind dominates. So we still have the pre-rational stuff going on, but we have the capacity to overrule it with the rational mind and say, I'm not going to do that now because I know that if I do that, then it's going to have bad consequences in the future. So, and then between 6 and 7, we go into the trans-rational zone, which is very interesting because it's not rational, right? So to somebody who's still living under the dominance of their rational mind to look at and think about this transrational process, it doesn't make sense. It's not rational. And the transition from rational to transrational usually takes us through a zone of confusion where we're trying to swap systems. It's like you're upgrading your computer operating system, but you go through a point where both systems are operating at the same time, and you're trying to figure out which one you should take notice of. And so one of the things that happens during that transition process is, in the confusion, people often regress back to pre-rational. And so for people who are in transition from 6 to 7, often they can be personally confused, but they can also appear to be a bit crazy from the outside, because partially they're operating from basic fears and superstitions which come from the pre-rational zone, and partially they're operating from this extremely sophisticated quantum consciousness, this direct intuition, right? And so you get a mixed bag of information from them, and there are a whole bunch of high-profile public figures out there who are out there talking about change. One who comes to mind is David Icke, who offer some stuff which is really solid and really useful, and other stuff which is just totally wacky and based on fear and superstition. And if you watch these people, you can see them over time gradually becoming more transrational, so their messages are getting better and more reliable over time, usually if they're going through a healthy change process.
Do you see kind of an Alex Jones type character fitting into that similar type of a...
Yes, I think so, and it comes from trying to make sense of the increased complexity, and not necessarily having a full tool set to do that. And so you're scrambling for anything that looks crazy, if you think about it from a rational-minded position, this transrational doesn't look rational. And so you're looking around for any explanation, any sort of process that doesn't look rational, and you're going to try it out to see if it's useful. And oftentimes it's not useful. It just creates more confusion.
It seems like part of the breakdown of the rational we're seeing so much in this whole information war, like we were talking about earlier, where it's getting to a point where people just don't know what to believe anymore. And you see that this stuff is getting uncovered about certain scientific experiments being funded by certain places, or like you said, conspiracy theories turning out to be true, or the whole fake news thing. And there's so much you can basically find a great argument for either side of any topic if you want to. And so it's like, it does feel like that's a lot of people are getting stuck in hanging on to one of those sides, kind of based more on fear, where we're moving towards a time where we'll start to find which one resonates with us based on like an intuitive rather than based on paranoia or fear or whatever.
Yeah, so the way that plays out, if we start from the modern scientific industrial mindset, as we go into 6, what we start to do is we build a trusted network of people around us. And they're usually people who share our same value set. And then we bounce things off them. Do you think this is true? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's true? And we come to some kind of consensus in our supportive network that is useful enough for us to live by, because we're surrounded by like-minded people. But as that progresses, and as more people with this capacity for multiple perspectives keep popping up, it's going to get more and more confusing. We can already see that it's collapsing science, right? Apart from the fact that science has been corrupted by the sort of latter stage scientific industrial mindset, which wants to manipulate things to its own benefit. Traditional science is going to get corrupted further because of this multiple perspective issue. And what it's all doing over the longer term is it's creating more and more tension. We're going to eventually get to the point where we're going to think, I can't even trust anybody else that I ask about this anymore. I've got to actually come back to what I know, right? And that leads us into this second tier leap into direct knowing, personal direct knowing, which doesn't come through other people. It comes directly through our own consciousness. And so that's kind of the evolutionary pathway. So knowing that that's where we're headed, you can get a rough idea of how this is going to play itself out.
It seems like, again, I'm looking through a certain lens on social media and on the internet and everything, but it does seem like there's some examples of that, as far as it seems like there's a rise in people rediscovering and appreciating things like astrology, and just talking a lot about intuition and cultivating intuition and practicing meditation and journaling and just all these things that kind of connect us with a deeper part of ourselves that's maybe beyond sort of the layer 5, getting everything from some authoritative source of information.
That's exactly right. And, to take your example of astrology, when practiced from layer 4 consciousness is not the same as astrology that's practiced from layer 6 consciousness. Mm-hmm. Okay, layer 5, because of its materialistic bent, doesn't tend to take notice of things like astrology. But if you go beyond 5 to 6, and remember that these things are wrapped inside each other, so on the foundation of scientific knowledge from layer 5, you wrap layer 6, which is this capacity to take additional perspectives, then you can start to unwrap the finer details of astrology, and it can become a very sophisticated science.
Yes.
And particularly when it gets into second tier, looking at astrology from layer 7, it becomes an extremely sophisticated science, and a lot more reliable and useful than it is when interpreted from previous layers.
Yeah. So one of the things, we're getting close to the end of your time here, and I want to be respectful of that, but I kind of wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on how this stuff kind of can essentially just becoming aware of both the change process, because I think that in and of itself is very powerful, but also the layers. How can it help a person just individually, maybe just to understand their life better, or how to move through change more fluidly? Maybe you have personal experiences of how it's helped you. I think right now a lot of people are looking for anything that can, help just sort of ease any tension in their life and help these transitions. So I'm just kind of wondering how you see that.
Sure. It's going to be different depending on where the individual is at on their change journey. So I think just knowing that there are different layers of consciousness and that each one is essentially a world of its own that has its own values and motivations, its own capacities, which are more advanced than the previous layer but limited when viewed from the next layer. So just knowing that is the case, it can help people start to get on with each other better. When they bump into somebody who has completely different values, instead of just thinking that they're wrong and, maybe you should kill them, then you can start to appreciate that, okay, wow, this person is actually living in a different world than me. They have a completely different value set. And just from a rational-minded point of view, that can be useful, and if you get a better understanding of this work, and Clare Graves is not the only researcher who's mapped out these different layers of consciousness. There are a number of others out there that have done what is essentially developmental psychology research. And each model, from different researchers is slightly different, but they're all about human nature, so there are lots and lots of overlaps. So I think that can be comforting just to understand that, and understand that that's essentially the root of all conflict on the planet, is this fact that people live according to different value sets, and there's an inherent desire often to want to change other people to fit with your value set, to change their society to fit with the way your society operates. And so we can start to pull back, moderate those urges that we might have to fight back against somebody because their values are different, or to treat them differently, and start to become more understanding and compassionate. And this extended sensory perception and capacity for compassion that comes with layer 6 is very well suited to supporting that process, where we can literally start to feel what it's like to be in that person's body and experience what they're experiencing. And we're seeing more and more of this. And often when people are going through their transition and sort of transiting through layer 6, they'll report, God, I feel sad today and I don't know why. There's nothing happening in my life that's cause for sadness, but I just feel this deep sadness, and they're tapping into other perspectives, the collective of humanity. And that's a very real thing, and it's being reported by lots and lots of people. And it's the kind of thing that will be played down or discarded by layer 5 thinking. It doesn't fit with the layer 5 scientific industrial mindset, but it's a very real thing. And so one of the useful things that we can do is to find other people who are going through the same thing that we're going through, and we're naturally drawn to do that anyway when we're moving into and transiting layer 6. We want to get together with other like-minded folks. We've got the technology to do it. What we do need to do is to try and make it more personal, so face-to-face, in-person connection rather than just electronic connection, which is obviously missing something, and a lot of people are noticing that it's missing something.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the model can be useful in that respect. It can be really useful in having a map of the change process and starting to map your experience onto this little model that Clare Graves has made. And, you wake up and you don't feel right, and you pull out that map and you go, oh, wow, something's changed in my life conditions, right?
Yep.
If I look around and figure out what that is, I might actually be able to transit this change faster and with less chaos. And that's a fact. You can do that. Once you start to understand, okay, this is the trajectory of change, it's like kind of, walking across the countryside and you get to the top of the hill and everything's fine, you've got a great view, and you're happy, and you realize that you've got to move, and you look down and you see, wow, I've got to actually go down in that valley, and there's a really fast-flowing river down the bottom. I've got to get across that somehow,
Yeah.
And to have a map, to know that, okay, if I'm experiencing this now, then likely what's coming next is this, disintegration or chaos phase where I've got to actually loosen up and be open to new ways of living. That can be really useful.
Yeah.
In the same way that having a map can be useful if you've got to walk across the countryside.
Definitely. And we didn't really touch on the psychedelics, but plant medicines or any of that type of stuff. But I'm pretty familiar with that stuff, and I definitely know how much of a benefit it can be. But also, if people don't have access to that sort of stuff, I've heard you mention even just as something as simple as doing something totally out of the ordinary, or trying something new, whether it's meeting up with a group that you've never met, or just any new activities seem to help with that transition in some sense.
Yeah, it's all about different perspectives, particularly, that's the case for every transition between every layer. Mm-hmm. And particularly for the layer 5, layer 6 transition, it's about being able to hold more perspectives. And so anything that's out of the ordinary is going to give you a different perspective. Altered states are extremely useful, and that's why humans naturally gravitate to drugs during times of change. It's embedded in our mythology. You think of how many times have you heard somebody say, "Oh, God, I've had a hell of a week. I've got to go and have a beer." Yeah. And what they're saying is, I've got to be able to change my perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're seeing this massive increase in the use of plant medicines and other drugs at this time in history, because that's actually supportive of our change process, provided that those things are used in a responsible way in the right setting. They can also be destructive if they're not used responsibly, or people don't have the right structure or setting for using them. So it's worth educating yourself if you're going to explore anything like that, to make sure that you do it in a responsible way, and you do it with people who know what they're doing, not some redneck cowboy who's just decided that he's a shaman last week and is trying it out himself. So the change map can be really useful. And also things like understanding that in layer 6, we have an inward focus. It's natural that we want to try and discover who we are, and we want to try and connect with other people more deeply. We want to heal ourselves. And all of these things are things that you can anticipate, by checking Clare Graves' work. It's unfortunate there's not a lot of good material out there, source material on Graves at the moment. I don't know whether you caught my recent podcast where I mentioned the latest book that's come out was just published last year, and it's a really, really good summary of his work and his model. For someone who is unfamiliar with it, this would be a great introduction.
Very cool. Yeah. Clare W Graves, his life and his work.
His life and his work.
That just came out recently.
Yeah, it was only published last year. In fact, I haven't even finished reading it yet. I'm just I'm about sort of 3/4 of the way through it, but it's a really solid little condensed version of his work, his research, and findings that he made.
What layer do you think Clare was at?
He's on record as saying that he's got a lot of red, layer 3, but I think he was a really humble guy, and for him to be able to document a multi-dimensional model, he must have had some second tier consciousness going on there. I've got no doubt. Just the way that his pattern recognition worked as he was doing the analysis, and he displayed at least layer 6 consciousness in that he realized that his own perspective on the data was going to skew it. And so he had a group of 7 peers, academic peers, that he asked to also look at the data, and without giving them any direction, he just said, take a look at this data and tell me, what you see in it, if you see any patterns or anything. And so that was a very layer 6 approach to doing that. And, it's quite likely, I think, that he had some second tier layer 7 consciousness at play as well, just because of the sophistication of his findings.
Yeah, it seems like to come up with a model like that and be able to see all those layers, you kind of have to be at that integral.
That's right, yeah.
Do you see more and more people, I think, even if it's not necessarily Clare's model specifically, you're gonna start to see this sort of understanding come up more and more, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. And developmental psychology is one field which is particularly oriented towards that second tier multidimensional understanding. Quantum mechanics is another one. And, we're seeing a rise in discussions about quantum mechanics and how they impact our reality and our life. So these sorts of things that are multidimensional in nature, we're only going to see an increase here.
Awesome. Yeah, when I first started checking out your stuff, I had heard of this stuff through Ken Wilber years ago. Mm-hmm. But at that time, I thought it was interesting, but it didn't quite strike me as much as it has in the last couple of years, maybe because I'm in a transition or whatever. But
most likely.
Yeah, it really, I'm just shocked at why it's not more widely out there, because it really blows my mind, and I just see it around me every day, It really seems to match up.
It's really interesting because to really understand the multidimensional nature of the model or the theory, you have to have some, at least, second-tier consciousness at play. So for people who are in transition, they might still be mostly in layer 6, but they're just starting to get glimpses into the multidimensional nature of layer 7 consciousness. They're the people that are really going to have their minds blown and are really going to go, whoa, okay, wow, this is much bigger than I thought it was. Yeah. And it's much bigger than you thought it was, because when you were thinking before, you weren't thinking from that complexity,
Yeah. Well, hey, I really appreciate you doing this. It was great, and I could talk to you forever. Do you have any cool things coming up? I know you do some talks at conferences, or where can people check out more of your work, and what are you up to in the future?
Sure. My personal website is emanate.net, so that's EMAN figure 8.net. And they can find videos of my various talks around the place there. I did a talk in Zurich, Switzerland last year, which is on my website now. You'll find it on the front page. And it's my latest and greatest version of, explaining Clare Graves' work in 40 minutes.
Awesome.
So it's a good introduction. What have I got coming up? I'm working on a really big project that was seeded in 2005. So it's a long-term project. It's about supporting global scale consciousness change, and it started to gather momentum in the last few years. When I first envisioned it back then, which really came in an inspirational way, I couldn't see how it was going to happen, to be honest with you, and so I kind of took it with a grain of salt. And over the years, things have started to fall into place, and I'm now fully convinced that, okay, this is actually going to happen. And it's multifaceted, so it's about technologies for developing consciousness in one respect. So it's about finding ways that we can accelerate human development. And part of that, of course, is looking at tools like altered state things, like psychedelics and other altered state technologies, and ways that we can smooth this change process so that it's easier to navigate. You can navigate it faster. You can integrate better. And the idea is that we're facing so many challenges at a global level now. The only way that we're going to resolve them is through second-tier consciousness. And the more people that we have at second-tier consciousness, the smoother the ride is going to be. And so it's important to find these technologies and to roll them out so that people have got access to places, much like they did back, if you think back to Layer 4 and ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian societies, where there were temples where you could go, where there were specialists in consciousness. And with the second tier leap, we're seeing this integration of science and spirituality. So, we look back at historically and we say, it wasn't all that religion, but actually, it's just another perspective on reality.
Kind of like a new version of a mystery school.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So that's one of the facets of this project, is to really bring back that aspect of society where there is a temple or whatever you want to call it in the local town, and you can go there and there'll be specialists there who know about consciousness and developing consciousness, and you can do whatever you want to do in terms of developing yourself there. So that's one aspect, and I've been working a lot on that over the past 5 or 6 years, really immersing myself in the technology of plant medicines and psychedelics in general. I'm co-founder of a psychedelic research organisation here in Australia, and that interest is going to continue. And another facet of this project, and incidentally, the project that I'm talking about is called RD. It's AADII, and that stands for the Agency for Advanced Development of Integrative Intelligence. RD is also, it's developed from a Sanskrit word, which means the beginning, or to shine light upon, like a new dawn.
Very cool.
And so another aspect of the RD project is to create a network platform that will be internet-based, which is kind of like training wheels for the development of our own inherent interdimensional communication technologies. But the idea is to create a network platform, in other words, a platform where people can come and use the latest technology to run their own networks in a more efficient way. And it will be a values-oriented platform. So the platform is being specifically designed for anybody who is working to support the consciousness shift globally or locally, right? And you can join it as an individual or as a group. So there'll be like an umbrella network where everybody can just be there as individuals, and there'll be ways of bringing your own network. So if you're running an institute or a school or a business or whatever, and it happens to be oriented towards shifting consciousness, then you can jump on the platform, use the technology, which will be mainly driven by mobile, and at the same time, you'll see all the other networks on the platform and individuals. And so the idea is that it will enhance visibility globally, so we can see everyone else, all the other organizations, more easily, that are all working towards the same outcome, whether it be across different disciplines or the same discipline. People will come from all walks of life, whether they be techies or, psychologists or whatever. And in the process of occupying this platform, there'll be greater visibility, collaboration will be easier, and we ought to be able to accelerate the development of consciousness globally, and also the transition from one value system to the next value system ought to be smoothed out, a reduction of social turbulence. Because without that kind of common platform, we're in for a very rough ride over the next couple of decades as we go through these, not just one paradigm shift, but multiple paradigm shifts occurring simultaneously. Yeah. So I guess those two things are the key aspects of the RD project. There's an educational element, which you've already really addressed. We need to get this information out there, and that'll have a media arm, which is being headed up by Mitch Schultz, who is the director of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, who's a close colleague of mine. And we'll also have research and development functions, where we can help develop new technologies. and there's a futurist element also. So using this technology and the map that Clare Graves gave us to look forward into the future and anticipate what's coming. And we can certainly do that already in terms of knowing what the themes of the change are going to be. With further dedication, we can improve our capacity to anticipate the future and, again, smooth the turbulence as we go through this change process. Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I could get into so much more stuff with you. So if you're ever willing to come on again, I'll do my part to spread the word.
I've really enjoyed talking to you, so I'm happy to do another podcast sometime if you want. Yeah,
I'd love to. Yeah, I listened to your Future Sense, and that's another thing people should know about. I'll go over some stuff in the intro, and I'll put links in the notes. But Future Sense is a great podcast.
Thank you.
Every week a new episode comes out.
Yeah, every week. So we actually do it as a live radio show here in Byron Bay, and we just record the radio show, and then we have a guy in Bosnia who edits out the music and promotional announcements and that kind of stuff, and then we put out the basic discussion as a podcast. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there's nothing else quite like it out there yet, I don't think. So
no, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be at the leading edge and be pathfinders.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Steve.
Thanks, Jacob. It's great to talk to you, mate.
You have been listening to Awake, Aware, Alive with your host, Jacob Gossel. If you would like to support this podcast, head to patreon.com/Jacob Gossel and throw me $1 a month.
Because I want to do more of these. And I need your help. Thank you.